Hello, everybody. My name is Martin Lovers. I'm Chief Trend Watcher of Supply Chain Media. I will be the moderator of this live webinar. We will talk about the future of work in supply chain in 2030. And with me, I have two experts. I'm very proud to announce. First, the grand lady of supply chain, Laura Cecilia from Supply Chain Insight. Laura, hi.
Hey, thank you, Martin. Thank you for calling me the grand lady. Does that mean I'm the old lady?
I didn't say old. No, I didn't say.
Thank you, Martin.
Yeah, no problem. And next to Laura, we have Sean Cooley. He's the author of the magnum opus of supply chain, I would say, Transition Point. Sean, welcome.
Thanks, Martin. Nice to be speaking with you, Laura. Good to see you again, or speak to you at least.
Yeah.
All right, so in the next hour, we'll have an interactive discussion with the three of us, but the audience can join. So this will be recorded. Everybody is on mute, but you all have the opportunity to ask questions. There are two options. You can chat, and everybody can see that and answer the chat questions. Or, and then I prefer that, you can ask your questions in the questions panel on the right side. You see the question mark. And if there are a lot of questions, you can even vote on the questions. And if these questions are in line of the discussions we are having, I will ask these questions straight away, so to make it interactive. And after the hour, so we have an opportunity to extend it. So then we will go into the lounge, Laura, Sean, and myself. And you can join us over there, and in that 30 minutes, you can also, in a kind of Zoom meeting, you can extend the conversation and go into discussion with Laura, Sean, and myself. So there are a lot of opportunities here. You can zoom in your presentation, so you see the presentation and you see the small arrows, and you can, take the presentation full screen if you want to zoom in the slides. All right. First, Laura did a survey last fall about planning during the pandemic. And I would like to ask Laura, what are your basic findings? What are the business pains?
Well, thank you, Martin. We started this research through a series of qualitative interviews of 35 supply chain leaders greater than 1 billion in revenue. And we wanted to understand what their business pain was, and that was followed up by a quantitative survey that we solicited through respondents in LinkedIn. So I've got about 320,000 people that follow me on LinkedIn, and I use that as a research panel. So this data is very much companies greater than 1 billion. And essentially, before the pandemic, supply chain visibility was the largest pain. And I would caution that a lot of people have visibility projects, but they've got lots of them and they're not connected and they're not driven with the goal in mind. But in the pandemic, demand and supply volatility became the predominant business pain, and people didn't know what to do with it. Many people turned off their supply chain planning solutions because we hadn't really architected them for the levels of volatility that we saw in the pandemic. Even companies with what-if analysis couldn't use them because they were too hardwired into the IT infrastructure. And we didn't have supply chain master data to really help us with what was happening in the variability on lead times and some of the work around transfer of products from ports. So we found that the infrastructures that we built just weren't sufficient for what we were seeing. Although companies that had good capabilities between finite scheduling available to promise and descriptive analytics were able to far better than those that had really focused on tightly integrated planning into ERP and had focused only on demand and tactical supply planning. Does that help, Martin?
Yes. And what I saw lately, especially in automotive, now there are a lot of problems in automotive, scarcity of material, lack of chips. But basically, they shut down the factories last year and then have to revamp their supply chains. And now, all of a sudden, they don't have any parts to manufacture cars anymore. So we also saw that probably in automotive, they took some wrong decisions on that part, and now they don't have the needed parts to manufacture the cars. What do you think?
Well, the issue around semiconductors is a great case study for why we need to collaborate with suppliers. What happened is the semiconductor industry services many industries which had a very marked change in demand. Consumer electronics went up. A lot of the work around, the digital home increased the demand for electronics. Automotive companies shut down and they really stopped talking to their semiconductor suppliers, just assuming that those parts would be there. And automotive is a laggard when it comes to working with suppliers, and they're paying the price. What happened was, we had some unusual situations. We had a foundry that was closed in Japan, and they're just out of touch with their suppliers, and they're really out of touch with the market. So it's a great example of supply chain leadership that is really stuck in the past, where the automotive industry tries to stronghold the rest of the value chain. And electronics companies are like, the lead times are longer than that. We don't have the inventory. You're going to have to wait.
Yeah. And then in the same time, the automotive industry is still holding on to, when they get orders for new cars, they hold up these orders, and if they have enough, then they will release it to the factories. So that's the reason why you had to wait for over 8 months for a BMW or an Audi, whereas the manufacturing time is only a few days. So even on the demand side or the customer side, I think also they have to change and think differently about the market.
Absolutely. The automotive value chain in Europe is different than the automotive value chain in North America. And neither of the continents are we doing a good job of sensing what customers want and translating it. If you look at all of the data that's available on the configurators on the websites of people looking at cars, we don't use that data. We're not really automating the value network in automotive. And I'm hoping that we don't just walk away from this saying, there was a risk management issue on semiconductors, but a need to redesign automotive to be more effective in working with value chain partners.
Yesterday I heard from one of the larger automotive manufacturing companies in Europe that they didn't have any metal. Basically, Tata Steel couldn't deliver, and the reason why, they don't have enough oxygen in India, because the oxygen is needed in the hospitals. So even hospitals are competing with steel manufacturing for oxygen, and based on that, automotive can't get any steel because of that. So that's even awkward, I would say.
Yeah, well, we've got disruptions everywhere, right? So we've got polymer issues out of the issues that we had in Texas with energy, because of the risk management issues on security on the pipeline. We've got, gasoline rationing now in the United States. And we've got the horrific issues in India where, it's all hands on deck to try to get oxygen to India. So, whether it's, the 30 ships sitting off of Long Beach or the Suez Canal where 13.5% of the volume moves through, or the closure of the port of Montreal, we're just in a mess. And so only 9% of companies design their supply chains, actively design. And now's the time, I think, for us to design regionally for lower variability of lead times and better supplier collaboration.
So what are the next steps? And you did a survey also on that.
Right. So companies are looking at how can they have what if scenarios to understand what's happening. And these will not be hardwired into the IT infrastructures. They'll be more sandbox-like. Some people call these digital twin. We've got a fascination in supply chain with, shiny objects. So, it's the ability to do modeling that is not hardwired into the back office IT infrastructure. And then we're also going to be looking at visibility in very different ways. Today, the average company has 15 visibility projects. They're all on the go, whether it's telematics and, we're just awash with transportation signals, or it's better visibility of what's happening in planning with, demand translation or whether it's manufacturing automation. And so what we're going to see is the evolution of visibility tied to the goal in mind. So looking at how do I better inform available to promise? How do I better inform allocation? How do I build rules-based ontologies that can tie order management to ATP to allocation with all of these signals? And how do I amplify the signal and reduce the noise? I'm working with one company that's done a great job of working on non-SQL, demand sensing, unstructured text sentiment, telematics, and now their roles have over 2,000 exceptions a day. And I'm like, that's just untenable. We've got to be able to drive the signal and reduce the noise. And then we're going to redesign for regional and local supply, really looking at the variability of trade lanes and building supply chain master data where we know what is happening in the variability of the transits and also the variability of what's happening in supply, whether it's quality or conversion rates. You know, we implemented a lot of our planning systems, just putting in that data, you know, and the first time we turned it on, and we really don't have good reference databases for planning master data. So we'll see that. And then I think we're going to be rethinking work. It's my goal to try to make planning open to all. If you think about supply chain planning, only 3% of the back office actually has access to planning. And my question is why? Why is planning not self-service? Why can we not open up planning and decision support tools for everyone in the back office, right? So Dow has 300 planners and they've got 18,000 people in the back office. Why can we not really work on the federation and the redesign of planning systems and decision support so that we can have wider use of planning and we can think about it more broadly? So those are some insights. Does that help, Martin?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So we're going to talk next about, you know, how we should design work in supply chain for the future. And, you know, I have used a slide like this, and it's based on the slide by Porter. And, you know, it is, you know, in the Western world, we're reading from left to right, starting with raw material suppliers and go to the right. We end up with consumers or customers. So I think, you know, Laura has said we have to rethink this and we start with customers first, isn't it, Laura?
Well, I've got three fundamental issues with this slide. One is customer, and channel should be on the left-hand side. We should start the supply chain with the customer's customer and the market drivers. And I'll tell you a story, Martin. I teach supply chain classes, and one of the things I do is I have people draw a supply chain. And of all the students that I've taught, when they pick up their crayons and their markers for the whiteboard, they always draw either the supplier or the plant or a truck. Mm-hmm. So by definition, we're very supply centric. So we've got to break that. The second issue is supply chain here is a function within other functions. And to me, the supply chain is a series of flows from the customer's customer, supplier's supplier that crosses all functions, that looks at how do I not only do source, make, and deliver and plan, but how do I also manage commercial teams? How do I manage portfolios? How do I manage new product launch? And the third is that, you know, all these boxes, right? We've hard-coded a lot of boxes, a lot of engines, but we don't have the way to translate policy and flows. And most people don't have one supply chain. They've got 5 to 7 based upon the rhythms and cycles of the supply chain.
Yeah, no, I'm totally agreeing with you. I have an updated version of this one, but you know, you're totally right. You know, we were trained to think from left to right. You know, starting with raw materials. We have all kind of sayings from grain to the drinks and that kind of stuff. But I have translated this view into a soccer team, so that's less boxed in and more fluid. So why? So this is the same business function seen in the previous slide, but now it's like a soccer team, and you have different roles and who's playing the ball to who, and this is more fluid in the sense than in the previous slide. So this is a much of an improvement, in my opinion, than the previous slide. And still, we have to service the customer. That's our goal, and how we score goals is another thing. So my question is, this might be a better representation, but maybe in America you are used to playing American football and not so much soccer.
Well, I think it gets to the definition of the team, right? A soccer team is different than a football team, different than a basketball team. And most people do not define policy and strategy and rule sets. And so as a result, you've got more scrum on the field than we'd like to admit.
Yeah. And but if you look at this soccer team that has 11 players, whereas the startups, like the Amazons, have outsourced a lot and playing with less teams, and maybe they're playing ice hockey with the puck going quite quickly over the field. So this might be an old representation of the usual suspect, the multinationals with a lot of business functions. And when I show this slide, you have legal on goal about compliance, that kind of stuff. So you're totally right. The CEO on the side of this field can only shout about what to do, but in the end, every player should know what kind of role they have. And you're right. Probably in a lot of organizations, these functions are not defined that much. Next, and then we go and getting more into the future. I have also a representation of what you mentioned. It starts, and that's my newer slide. In the middle, you start with the customer needs and the buying behaviors, and this buying behavior can change overnight or even during the day in B2B and B2C. And basically, you have different strategies: product leadership going north, overall excellence going southwest, customer intimacy going southeast. And what you said, Laura, yeah, I totally confirm. Most companies have different supply chains. I've done a lot of research on this, and I watched Johnson & Johnson, and they have all the 6 supply chain types mentioned here. So this is the complex world of supply chain, started with the customer needs and buying behavior, and then fanning out into the supply chain. So what is your view on this, Laura, about this kind of representation?
I think these kind of dialogues are valuable, but when the rubber hits the road, we have nothing in the supply chain today that connects rules, policies to engines. What we've automated is transactions and optimization, and there's a need for us to rethink our architecture.
Have we lost Martin, Laura?
I think so.
Yeah, it's one of those things. Am I the one who's been booted out, or is it the host?
Yeah, I think we've lost Martin. I'm not sure if people can hear us.
I think I'm just reading your comments in the chat, Laura. I totally agree with the points that you're making there about the design of organizations. And in fact, I have an issue generally with the sort of the football field analogy that Martin Prince puts on place, because it works from the premise that everyone knows what the objective is, and the objective is to score the goal. And I think most organizations I've dealt with, there isn't a clear objective that everyone's all aiming towards. At the same time, they have different objectives based on where they sit in the organization, with different measures of success and different drivers and different agendas. And it's more like watching I guess preschool soccer, where everyone chases the ball at the same time, rather than a team working fluidly around a common objective.
Right. We have this game called T-ball in the States where, young kids play T-ball and they're lucky to get it off the tee. And it's very similar. And it's funny because people will talk to me about they want to have this end-to-end strategy. And I say, what is an end and what is an end? And most of it is just hardwired for whatever technologists they have talked to. But, we've spent 1.7% of IT on technology. And I think that we've gone down rat holes where we have basically focused on transactional efficiency versus a workforce effectiveness. Hi, Martin. We're chatting. And we've not built value chains. So there was a discussion on the chat about value chains and value chain interoperability. And today, the supply chain operating networks that we have do not interoperate. There is no common sign-on. It's a lot like the issues back when, 1980s, when we had cell phones and, Vodafone didn't connect with AT&T. And it's very similar. We don't have authoritative identifiers. We don't have onboarding that's common. And we really need to rethink networks. And many times people think, blockchain is the panacea, but blockchain is not really scalable at this time. Martin, we were continuing.
Yeah. Happy that you did so, because I was kicked out for one reason or another. Let's move. So I heard it, your discussion. What I was thinking, going into the future, and then we go to the stuff Sean has written about. And one of my favorite slides by MIT, by Mahendra Singh, is about scenario planning, looking into the future. So basically, he is explaining what is scenario planning. So looking forward, start of today, looking into the future for the next decade or decades. What kind of scenarios could you imagine, alternative worlds, and that could also be alternatives in an economic sense or even in a military sense. So can you imagine that Russia is invading the Baltics? What will happen then? Or can you imagine that carbon will be taxed, that kind of stuff? Or can you imagine that, in a political sense, that all things could happen between China and Taiwan or whatever? So that there will be alternative scenarios. That's the things what Shell is doing. And that was started already in the early 70s, where they created alternative scenarios for, the happenstance that Israel might be invaded by the Arabic countries. And that happened in 1973. And based on that, Shell already had all the scenarios in place, what to do, what this kind of thing happened. So, and then you have to design your business and your supply chain. You have to track what kind of scenarios will take place in the future. And my question is to you, Laura and Sean, are supply chain professionals prepared to do this, to look into the future and to look at how businesses are going to change and what does it mean for supply chain? Laura, what do you think? Are supply chain professionals ready to do scenario planning and look into the future and do exercises like this?
I think that supply chain leaders want to do scenario planning, and they want to free scenario planning to just not be in the hands of planners with an average tenure of 2 to 3 years of time with the company. They want more robust systems to be able to do this, but they also want the ability to tie strategy to action through rules and policy. And, we are very weak in the supply chain around rule implementation, whether it's inventory matching, allocation, ATP, and the ability to translate strategy into policy and rules is a very big weakness in today's architecture. So conceptually, they want to do it, but they get caught up in the fact that we've not architected to be able to do this.
And Sean, what do you think? Are supply chain professionals prepared to look into the future, and do they know how to look into the future?
I think there are two questions. I think they would say that they're prepared to look into the future, but whether or not they can or not is dependent a lot of times between sort of the leadership and the organisation that they operate in. There's a lot of scared bunnies right now, if I can use that phrase, because obviously the currency of experience is rapidly being devalued given the rapid rate of change that we go through. And the ways that things used to be done is no longer look like the way it's going to be done moving forwards, and that has exposed a lot of people to realize that they've invested quite significant amounts of their time in figuring out how to operate in a way that's no longer valid. But I would like to believe that most people are open to the concept of embracing new ways of thinking and new ways of operating, but in a lot of cases they don't know how to do that, or they're not incentivized to do that, because we end up with changes in strategic direction at the top level that isn't boiled down in any meaningful way to the actions that people do at a transactional or a tactical level. And I think this ties into the point that Laura made, that we end up finding that we can change roles and responsibilities or processes on a flow chart, but actually a lot of what drives behaviors is the inherent sort of business rules and contractual agreements that we've locked ourselves into. It's one of the reasons why I think startups can be more nimble and reactive, is because they design agreements and rules and processes for the future rather than being tied back by legacy structures and contracts and agreements and business rules that have existed in a more linear transactional past, shall we say.
Yeah. So you have written in your book Transition Point about different economic waves, the Kondratiev waves.
Yes.
So in your opinion, the future is quite sunny, not so bleak. Some might think, especially around this COVID pandemic era. So could you explain where we're at the moment?
Yeah, well, we're at the difficult point, shall we say,
Okay.
of the wave. We're at the most disruptive period, what's known as this sort of upswing. We've come out of the transitional period between the fifth and the sixth wave, and we're now in the most disruptive, but also the most dangerous point, where you see a large number of sort of paradigm shifts taking place, but also power battles, and you can see that going on all around us at the moment. Everything from the sort of culture wars through to the sort of geopolitical battles between the US and China, or Australia and China, and all these sorts of movements. And a lot of these have social side effects. So everything from the Yellow Vest protests to the Black Lives Matter movements, they all take place at this point in the cycle, because we're moving away from an old operating model and moving into a new one. And specifically from an economic perspective, this is the time where people with capital can win big, because of these new emergent technologies and new companies and new opportunities to make money from them. And people who only have their labor to sell and their experience and their sweat to trade find themselves a little bit exposed and feeling left behind. So you see these wealth inequality gaps arise. Now, assuming that society takes recalibration actions to help sort of close this, what's called the cultural lag, then you should move forwards into a new golden age. Unfortunately, before that, what I believe we will see is an economic bust, because there is a bubble that builds, and it builds every time, from the tulip manias in the Netherlands through to the canal manias in the UK, through to the cyber currency, the Bitcoin crypto currency mania that's taking place at the moment. In fact, we see massive investments in that just over the last weekend, Doge coins and things like that.
Yeah.
People have invested in that will ultimately bust. We have some worrying things in this wave. We didn't clear down the bad debts and the bad business from the last wave. The banks were saved from failing, but also so were the bankers, and that meant that a lot of the lessons weren't learned and a lot of the debts were carried forward. COVID's just hit, so we've just now gone back to the money printing machine and press burr, and that's printing off money as if the rules of economics no longer matter. Sort of new types of monetary policy where we just print more money because with fiat currencies they're not tied to the gold standard or anything like that anymore, so we can just do whatever we want. Well, there is going to be a side effect for that, and that side effect will be either hyperinflation or a major economic crash. And in fact, if you have hyperinflation, it will probably end up in that crash, because we've been living off easy credit for a very long time. But from a technological perspective, these are very exciting days, because these are the days when all of the behind the scenes experimentations and developments that we've been seeing viral videos about really start to emerge in the market. And I think it's been driven specifically over the last 12 to 18 months by coronavirus. Has kind of really, I've always used the term, it's been rocket fuel to the to sort of automation revolution, because it's moved the cultural laggards, the older people, predominantly, I guess, people who would embrace things like e-commerce very slowly, and then kind of forced them to embrace things like online shopping and food delivery services. But it's also interestingly moved us towards some of the other things that I talk about in the book, with biometric payment systems, moving away from physical currency and towards digital currency, which was a direction it was always going to move into. And certainly there's a lot of governmental desire to do that, because it makes everything a lot more traceable than it is right now. So we're about to see the emergence of a lot of technologies and across the end-to-end supply chain. And it's one of the things I've been talking about since 2012, back in the days when everyone was talking about cloud computing and big data analytics, and Kiva Robotics was emerging, and these sorts of things, with what happens when these technologies connect and converge, and that's exactly what we're about to see now. And this is going to be it's going to be a very exciting time, but it's also going to be a very disruptive time for people whose jobs and livelihoods are solely wedded to the old ways of doing things.
But it won't be a clean upswing like the picture here on the slide.
No. That's a very stylized picture. In fact, interestingly, the upswing period takes around about 60 to 65% of the wave cycle, and each wave's about 40 to 50 years. So this is one of the interesting things. So most of the leaders of organizations, and most of the people who developed senior management positions in organizations were trained in the downswing. So you look back to the downswing, and it was all about efficiencies. It was about lean. It was about Six Sigma. It was about offshoring. It was about lower unit cost. Now, what we found, of course, is that these supply chains that were developed and designed, and organizations that were developed and designed in the downswing, have been dramatically exposed in the upswing. They've not been adaptive enough, they've not been agile enough, they've not been resilient enough, because they were designed from a premise of keeping costs low as much as possible. And where was the biggest cost? Most of the biggest cost was in labor. So where can we move manufacturing in a place where our biggest cost is less? And that was obviously China and other sort of Far Eastern countries, or in the US that would be Mexico and places like that. So that allowed unit costs to be brought down, but it was sort of predicated around a high degree of predictability, which we had in the 90s and the early 2000s, and certainly when I started work, you was always guaranteed that next year would look very much like last year. And certainly all the planning and the budgeting followed that sort of premise, that you took last year's sales and you added a bit to try and give the illusion of growth. We don't know what next month's going to look like now, let alone the next year or the next decade. So we're in a completely different world, and most of our planning systems and most of our leadership behaviors and most of our mindsets have not been designed and not been set up for this.
So Laura, what's your vision or your opinion on this view, this economic view of the sixth wave?
I think that we've got to redesign outside in, and I find that most people have gone backwards on early adopters, not forwards. And so this whole concept of innovation that Sean's talking about, I embrace. But, what I find in the research is we don't have a bell curve of innovators. We've got about 2% of innovators. And one of the real issues is that people can't step outside the box. They can't see their customers, and everything they do is so structurally encased with, I've got to have a fixed ROI, and it's a question of leadership.
Right. You also mentioned the PAL value chain. Maybe I can explain, and that's also relating what this Laura has mentioned, Sean.
Yeah, certainly. This was one of the concepts that I wrote about in some of my articles, and then sort of expanded it when I released Transition Point, sort of where we were sort of moving towards in terms of this sort of three, I guess, sort of macro trends that are affecting the supply chain, really, creating what I sort of named the PAL value chain. personalized, automated, and local. So, we're moving towards away from mass manufacturing and the manufacturer being in control by saying, look, this is what we're going to make and you're going to buy it, to the consumer being in control. And in order to adapt to that world, we're seeing sort of a trend of hyper personalization. So as we're capturing more and more data about the individual, we're able to personalize everything from products through to insurance policies, much more based around how you as an individual live your life and what you want, rather than sort of more generic sort of packages that you sort of fit people into boxes. So it's much more sort of personalized and contextual and situational based offerings. The wealth of data that we've uncovered has, I think, for those businesses that have the right mindset, there's great opportunities here. So, for example, all of the sensors that are being placed in cars, for example, are now able to extract data that an insurance company now can look at to say, well, I'm going to base your insurance policy not on the fact that you're between an age group of 18 to 25 and your gender, but rather based on your individual driving patterns and where you drive to. So you can end up with more personal services that are specifically designed around how you interact with the product, rather than just, like I say, just putting people into very generic and often quite unfair boxes. Now, a lot of that has obviously been driven by the second part, which is the automation of this across the end-to-end supply chain. And this is really, everything in sort. You've seen this many times when I've talked, Martin. We'll talk about, the different technologies that are taking place in source, make, deliver, sell, and plan. So across the end-to-end supply chain, we're doing everything from autonomous mining through to 3D printers and cobots, ASRS systems in warehouses, urban logistics, drone and Starship delivery robots, chatbots, digital assistants, all the way through to sort of cognitive computing, and then cognitive operating systems like Era that sort of manage at sort of plan level. The complete automation of the end-to-end supply chain, and things like RPA, for example, to manage this sort of the rules-based and repetitive tasks that don't really add any value, but do add a lot of human errors throughout the end-to-end supply chain. And then, of course, you've got things like blockchain that Laura mentioned. And because what this means is that it enables organizations who are able to look at these to say, well, can we address some of the restrictions that we have from our old linear downswing tailored one-size-fits-all supply chain to create much more agile and responsive supply chains by maybe looking at, using reshoring or nearshoring, by using automation that will ultimately, completely change the economies of scale. We can be driven. We've been driven by speed a lot at the moment. So getting goods close to consumers and being able to meet these very rapid delivery promises that we, certainly companies like Amazon keep sort of changing the game about, means that we're now looking at localizing a lot of manufacturing and being more strategic about positioning, rather than just taking a very blunt, where's cheapest kind of mindset. The end result is, of course, we if we can do this, we really start to understand the total cost to serve for each supply chain. And I think, Laura's point about only 9% of supply chains are actually being strategically designed. I think that's one of the most damning indictments of supply chain, really. It's always been an operational cost collector and never been seen as being something strategic. But now I hope it's being seen as something strategic, so that these tools and this sort of PAL perspective can mean that companies can start to look at, how do we best offer more personalized products and services using this new wealth of automation in such a way that we can meet our delivery promises and keep our costs low. So you can start to look at all of these tools from a strategic design perspective based on what the customer needs are, rather than just from a supply push perspective.
Yeah, but on the other hand, Laura just mentioned only a few percentage of the companies are so agile and forward-looking. So how many companies are embracing this PAL value chain? So you should, with the upswing in the end, most of the companies should embrace this kind of PAL value chain. Well,
the opportunity, I think that's the thing, that it's mindsets over machines, and I think the next slide talks about that. The challenge in a lot of cases is not what can we do, but whether or not we know what we want to do. And I always talk, the problem with transformation is never a lack of ideas, it's a lack of change in behavior. We have too many analog mindsets in what is now a very digital world. And that's why, in this upswing period, we see a lot of new companies thrive, because they're not weighed down with the baggage of the past. And other companies, who can't make that shift, really fail to survive in this very disruptive time. The points I make there, successful digital transformation has really got very little to do with technology. It's merely about transforming the mindset, the culture, and the strategy of the organization. And that goes for people and rules as well. You can fill your company with data scientists and machine learning specialists and, all of these kind of, roles. But unless you know exactly what you're going to do with them, and they know what their job is and what value they're supposed to bring, then, you're going to end up being, initiative rich and results poor, and data rich and insights poor. You're going to have a whole lot of data, but don't know what to do with it, because it's not aligned to any particular strategic outcome or aligned to any delivery of any customer value. And the thing is here again, there's been a massive number of failed digital projects. So, as you rightly said, a lot of these initial embracements of technology, because they're, as to Laura's point, shiny things, which always look good. Specifically, when you're sat in IT, it's always good to be kicking off another project, doing something that looks great on my CV. But unless you can associate that technology to the delivery of customer value, something that people are prepared to pay for in a level that brings you profit, then ultimately it's just a distraction. And this is what we've found with a lot of organizations who have set up things like Skunks Works or innovation hubs. They know that their organizational structure won't embrace that level of change. So they've tried to be innovative by creating an offshoot to their own organization, where they have a big sandpit to play around and test all these autonomous tools. But in itself, unless it's actually associated to the delivery of a desired outcome from a specified group of customers, i.e. a value proposition, then you're just playing. And there was a great book about called Pirates in the Navy that I've recently read. It was really moaning about the failure of these innovation hubs for that very reason. They test technology, but their technology hasn't been given a reason. You maybe automating what you already do, but it's not, you're not actually associating it with a true value proposition, and that becomes the issue, really.
Interesting thing is, supply chain has been in the spotlight in the last 12 months. Supply chain is hot. Everybody in the world recognizes the value of supply chain. But on the other hand, it looks like, supply chains are saving lives, but they are fixing problems. They're making happen anyway. But isn't it the point that for the future of work in supply chain, say in 2030, people or supply chain professionals should look more to business models, and how can we make new business models happen?
Yeah, no, this is probably one of my sort of fundamental lessons that I talk to people about all the time now. We originally sort of said, your products compete and companies compete. And then in 2001, Martin Christopher, one of my colleagues at Cranfield, said, actually, no, what you find is that supply chains compete. I don't think that's true anymore. I think business models compete, and the supply chain is obviously, a very crucial part of that business model. But it should be really designed in order to deliver a value proposition to a defined customer segment. And if you look at that from a number of different elements rather than just physical product, you're able to ensure that your supply chain is able to adapt as technology enables new and exciting ways to deliver that value proposition. So, I talk about sort of four primary mindset shifts that I like organizations to go through. And the first one is this, what I call the Copernican revolution. We used to believe that the Earth was at the center of the universe and the sun circled us. And then, Copernicus came along and said, no, actually, if you look through my telescope, you'll see that the sun is at the center of the universe, and we've been demoted to circling it. And I think a lot of companies have got to go through that shift themselves and sort of demote themselves, really. You're not the center of your universe, your customer is, and the customer now increasingly has more choices than ever before. So companies have to go through their own sort of Copernican business revolution and become much more customer-centric over firm-centric, which is why I think it's important to pick up on Laura's point that when you talk about the supply chain and you talk about mapping out what it looks like, you start from the value proposition, and you start from the customer, and you work back from there. And it might mean that actually the best way to deliver that value proposition excludes a number of the functions that you do right now, or outsources them, because that's better than just simply you doing it. Whereas if you move it the other way, you're always incorporating the things that have already existed, and it limits the imagination. And the other thing, the next one along, is the core principle of do the right things first, then the things right. Focus over what delivers value rather than just cutting costs, because I always, even when I talk to businesses in transformation, I try to avoid the word cost as much as possible, and we'll defer to the words like profit, because profit drives people to think about growth, whereas cost generally tends to to stop the people from being T-shaped and allows them to become much more I-shaped, because immediately they worry about the impact on their jobs or their departments, or just even their budget. The next one is problem solving, not product selling. I think this is absolutely key, really. Digital tools have enabled us to find new and incredibly exciting ways to solve problems. If you focus purely on product selling, you are completely at risk of falling into the Kodak trap of being so focused on developing a supply chain that's predicated around the thing you do right now, that you miss the opportunity to actually, deliver value to customers in new and exciting ways using these technologies. So, Kodak, had the opportunity to become Instagram, to use digital technology to capture and share memories, because that's what people want to do. They don't want film, they want to capture and share memories. It missed that opportunity, even despite the fact it was Kodak's engineers who developed the technology. And then that final one, I think, is, competing business models, not just competing products. The sort of concept of business model gets a lot of noise, but I don't think many people really understand it. And the supply chain obviously is a critical part of this. It's it's where the rubber hits the road, and in most cases. But we really need to be able to focus on who are the customer segments we're serving, what is our unique value proposition to them, and how do we operationally align behind a clear defined strategy, how we deliver that value proposition. And then new technologies can be looked at as a way of creating even new and better value propositions, or more effective and efficient ways of delivering that proposition, or just simply ways to eradicate waste. Now, to underpin that mindset shift, you also need a structural shift. And I think this is what Laura was talking about earlier, about much more segmented, strategically aligned end-to-end value chains, and not competing vertical functions.
So Laura, if you are looking at these 4 primary mindset shifts, which one is the hardest, in your opinion, for supply chain people?
Well, I'm not sure I can answer that. What I can say is that we do an annual evaluation called the Supply Chain Institute Meyer, where we look at 600 companies, and we ask the question, are companies making progress at the intersection of growth, margin, inventory turns, and return on invested capital? And 22 companies will usually rise to the top. And those that rise to the top have redefined their business model to offer a unique value proposition to a customer. And it can be in ways that, we don't even think about. Like, for example, Sleep Number wins the Supply Chain Institute Meyer 4 years in a row, because they don't sell beds, they sell sleep, and they have an analytics lab where they analyze the output of the beds, and they guarantee white glove delivery to clients' homes, and they change the buying experience. So what they're doing is they're owning the supply chain. Dollar General in the States wins 4 years in a row because they redesigned the value shopper. Companies that continue on their merry way, very functional, selling products like they've always done, just are not able to rise above the improvement at those intersections.
Okay, interesting. And you also talked, Sean, about human skills and new kind of skills. So can you elaborate about that a bit more?
Switch myself off mute.
Yeah.
The line I've used, in the book, and I use many times, if we're training people to compete against the machines, we're going to train them to lose. And I think that's a really important point. Certainly when we look at education systems, we have got more technological firepower than we've ever had before, but problem is we don't know what to do with it. So the skills that are really going to be important is not the skills that the machines can do, i.e. crunch numbers, look for trends in vast amounts of unstructured data, process transactions. They're always going to be able to do them better than us, cheaper than us, and more accurately than we can. So the skill sets moving forwards are really going to be about, what are the right questions to ask? What can we do with this information that these machines can provide for us? So they can track, consumer buying patterns, and they can clarify, exactly, who's going where and when. But what do we do with that information? And that's part of the problem, I think, why we're seeing so much digital disappointment, at the start. That there's too many projects that are kicked off without plugging in new tools, without really enough thought being saying, what do we want those tools to actually tell us? And what are we going to do with the information once it gives to us? How is it going to change our decision making? How is it going to change, the products that we sell and the way that we, design our supply chain network? No one's thought about that, and that's why I think the ROI on a lot of early investments has been so poor and so disappointing. The companies that are winning, of course, are the organizations who are able to really think about things like problem solving, not product selling, and use these technologies in ways to eradicate barriers to value or inconveniences that most other companies don't even believe it's their problem to solve. Amazon, for example, is always a great example of a company that keeps moving into areas and solving problems that people didn't realize could be solved, be that just walk out technology, which now is changing the very nature of physical retail, or things like the Amazon Echo, where you beat every other online retailer by not only creating a marketplace, but a marketplace you can just talk to. It's starting to change the very nature of how people engage with them as a retailer, and also that means that other companies are having to play catch up quick. They can implement the tools, but do they know what to do with them when they got them? And those tools are becoming easier to implement all the time through servitization. We can get everything from, Amazon itself is offering, the just walk out technology as a service. It's offering quantum computing as a service. It's now just released the offering for forecasting as a service. So it has, all of its forecasting firepower and algorithmic firepower available to, any organization that wants to hire it. The question is, do they have the people with the human skills and the freedoms to actually, take that information and make the same sorts of decisions that Amazon can make? I would think the answer to that in most organizations would be no.
No. Yeah, and I know, but it's not only Amazon. In the supply chain to admire, also Ahold, Albert Heijn in the Netherlands and Europe is mentioned, and they have also a Dutch Amazon called bol.com. And so they are also quite advanced. So it's not only Amazon. So Laura,
no, I just used them as an example. I didn't say they were the only ones.
No.
It's just, Albert Heijn is I think has been particularly innovative. Other companies that have had to adapt rapidly, like Ocado, for example, who rolled out its automated ASRS warehousing system, suddenly realized that actually there was more money to be made through selling its technical expertise in automation and robotics and to companies like Kroger than there was in actually being a retailer. And it created a whole new business model. So therefore, again, business models over products. It's the demand for its product was waning, but actually it saw an opportunity to create a whole new business model using completely different skill sets and different offerings. Because it had the right mindset, and in Ocado's case, it was because it was do that or die. It was the emergency of urgency, so to speak. But in a lot of organizations who don't believe they are facing imminent demise, because right now maybe their numbers are quite good, then unfortunately they don't see the pressure to transform, and that's when complacency can build.
Yeah, but even all the companies like Albert Heijn are able to transform themselves and rejuvenate themselves, and even Best Buy has rejuvenated themselves in the US. So Laura, Albert Heijn was in the supply chain to admire.
Yeah, they were last year, and unfortunately they don't make it this year. But but again, we're really at the cusp of talking about the business model and how we design processes outside in to be able to better serve customers in creative ways. And when we lock employees into functional silos, structurally encased by traditional technologies, we don't get there.
No. So getting back to the fifth wave and the sixth wave, Sean, you have stated the different goals and structures and mindset and cultures of these different waves. Could you explain more, and what does it mean for the curriculum of supply chain people for the future?
Yeah, I mean, this particular chart, it focuses less on sort of individual skill sets and more on sort of the mindset element of it, really, in the organizational structure, that needs to take place. Not going down to what it should look like, what boxes should go where, but the sort of mindset that should have that. If you look at your Amazons of the world, they think differently, and in fact, one of the best examples I had of that was when I led a roundtable in Berlin a couple of years ago, when I ran the roundtable on the barriers to transformation and then innovation, and I had all the usual suspects from all the big manufacturers in the automotive industry and other such companies. But I also had a representation of senior management from Amazon, which was quite unusual, to be fair. And I asked him, I said, are you lost? Are you at the wrong table? Because, you don't suffer any barriers to innovation generally. And he said, I was just interested in what other people said. And of course, what other people said were the things that, they always say, which is, the desire to deliver ROI, the focus on the short term and meet your analyst expectations, the fear of taking risks, and generally playing, not rather than playing to win, playing not to lose. And he said that the biggest challenge they have in Amazon, this is when I asked him, was employing people, very intelligent, very well educated people from other organizations, like the organizations that were sat at that table. And I asked him to just expand on that, because most of the people at the table looked quite shocked. And he said, well, we can't deprogram them. We really struggle to deprogram them because they have been so well taught and so well programmed, basically to think short term, to not take major risks, that when we tell them that the things are different here and we want you to sort of really not just think outside the box but assume there is no box, they can't do it. And in fact, they not only become a bottleneck independently, but because most of these people are quite senior, they become a bottleneck to their team and inhibit their team from thinking big. And he said most of the times we have to part ways. And that really stuck with me, really, that sort of deprogramming. And I thought, well, if you have to deprogram people, what is the programming that needs to take place in the organization? So based on all the other insights and information that gathered and read about, this was sort of a overview of that, which is moving away from the sort of analog industrial mindset into a much more digital one. It's obviously starts differently with the goals, and we're seeing that a lot at the moment. Moving away from sort of shareholder primacy and the long-standing belief, that Milton Friedman's belief that the only purpose of business is to generate value to shareholders, to actually, well, we can do that, but ultimately there might be some significant side effects to other stakeholders, such as the planet, such as customers themselves, the environment, and we need to focus on maximizing value from that. And certainly companies like Unilever have made that their goal very clearly and are really focusing on driving that through. And in fact, I just saw only today, just before this meeting, actually, that the shareholders at Unilever gave a 99% approval to Unilever's overarching directive to continue on, effectively fighting climate change through their actions. Opening your mindset away from just transactionally protecting your part of the market to realizing that actually there could be a whole host of new markets out there, and opening your thinking, moving in a Copernican business model way to move away from thinking about your firm, but think about the customer and consumer and what they want and value and what problems they need solving and how you can solve it, which helps you to move away from products and short-term profits into business models and long-term value. Well, the problem with most goals is most companies say they will change that goal, but it doesn't have any meat to the bone. It doesn't have any structure to it. And that's why I think, in order to make that happen, we need to move away from the sort of top-down command and control Frederick Winslow Taylor model into the realization, as Amazon has done, that everyone can have a good idea, and the ability to enact that on that idea should be able to come from anywhere, not just from the people who go to the once a year off-site meeting.
So that there might be a hard time to retrain people, but hopefully we can train the younger generations in the right direction. So we are almost out of time, and sorry, but it's quite interesting, and we can talk later afterwards like this. But Laura, could you explain what you're doing with Project Zebra? And then we have another slide about this. But Laura, can you explain briefly what you're doing about Project Zebra?
So thank you, Martin. I am an industry analyst, which an industry analyst determines key questions to ask, and a consultant basically has answers. And I have watched for the last 2 decades the gap growing between technologies that we have and the ability to use the technologies. So I appealed to all of the major technology providers in the space and said, let us go from an inside out perspective where we're very focused on orders and shipments to outside in, where we can free all the people in the back office from their functional silos to do self-directed work based upon market signals. And O9 said, well, I'll carry the mantle. And so we formed a group of 9 business leaders, 4 educational leaders, and ASCM. And we started looking at flows and redesigning of the supply chain outside in, and what they would look like, and what could happen if we put a rules-based ontology next to graph processing to really look at how we can drive decision support on markets potential and be able to align the organization in real time to a concept that we call the market knowledge graph. So if people are interested, send me an email. I'll put my email in the chat. You can sign up for a newsletter. I'll also be talking a little bit about the design of the capabilities tomorrow. And we're appealing to ASCM to redesign the plan box of the SCORE model to be able to be much more outside in, to use market signals and to sense and respond.
All right, thanks. You know, we have questions probably coming in, but we have the next 30 minutes into the lounge. But Laura will also speak about Project Zebra and some further research coming Tuesday at our Innovate event. You see it right here. So you have still time to register for coming Tuesday, and then she will talk half an hour about Project Zebra alone. Very interesting. So you can hear about that more coming Tuesday, or you can talk with her right after this. So for now, for all the listeners, thank you for listening. And if you want to learn more from either Laura, Sean, or me, you can have the next 30 minutes with us in the lounge. So right after this, we will be there and talk about the things we have discussed further. For now, Laura, thank you for joining us in this interesting discussion.
Thank you, Martin. My joy.
All right. Sean, also, thank you. Always a pleasure to hear about the 6th wave and how the world is going to change and what will be needed for, well, the next decades, I would say.
Likewise, Martin. Thank you for inviting me.
So thanks again. Maybe we'll see you in another webinar Wednesday, not coming Wednesday, but the week after that, because we have our Innovate event coming Tuesday. So again, for all the listeners, thank you for participating. And I will take a break and we move over to the lounge. So if you want to join us in kind of a Zoom meeting discussing with Laura and Sean, feel free to join. And hopefully we'll see you either in the lounge or at another event, Webinar Wednesday or Innovate Supply Chain event coming Tuesday, sorry, May 18th. Thank you, and bye for now, and I probably see you later in the lounge.